landscape. The place wasn't uninhabited though. Large concrete buildings were concentrated in several areas. Where we had arrived, I had no idea. Sarah started to laugh behind me. It was at that moment that all the pieces of the puzzle had clicked together in my head. I realized why Sarah felt so off. She knew what time it was on my phone, even though she had never checked it. There was no way she could have known which hour of the flight it was unless she had her own phone, which she never did. She wasn't affected by that shrill, high-pitched scream in the cabin. She was acting way too calm, like she knew exactly what was happening. As I felt Sarah's nails digging at both my shoulders, I realized that the list of rules had failed me when I had broke the first one. I had changed the course of things and those rules no longer had a time frame. Sarah continued to dig her nails into my shoulders and pierce my skin through my jacket. She leaned in close and whispered, "I am the Chaser." I was stuck in a bit of a pickle. The Chaser had tricked me and cornered me in the cockpit, and the plane seemed to have traveled to another dimension. I probably would have had a panic attack and mental breakdown at that moment, but I had something more important to deal with. The nails of Sarah, or the Chaser I guess, continued to dig into my shoulder, and they stabbed through my jacket into my skin. She seemed to possess inhuman strength in the way she easily punctured my jacket, and then my skin with just a blunt nail. But as I slowly turned my head around, I realized Sarah was truly just a facade. She had transformed into something else entirely. Her skin was gone completely white like a sheet of paper, and her fingers now ended in jagged, sharp, yellow fingernails. Her face had warped into a misfigured eyes, nose, and mouth that barely resembled the Sarah that I'd gotten to know. I quickly pushed back against her and kind of fell on her to push myself and her out of the cockpit. You don't truly know what you're capable of until you get that adrenaline surge and a survival situation. When your primal instincts take over, you don't think about anything that you do. And then, as soon as I was free from her grasp, I ran. I won't bore you with the details of the next 30 minutes of me running back and forth around the plane to avoid the Chaser. At first, I thought the other passengers would react, maybe catch me or something, but they were all gone. The entire plane was empty, and it was only me and the Chaser. I was starting to get tired and lose energy when the captain's voice broadcasted over the PA system once more. "The plane is landing at our destination. Please buckle your seatbelts." The Chaser took one final look at me before disappearing to the back of the plane. It puzzled me how the captain was now back in the cockpit and landing the plane. Curiosity overtook me, and I thought that I had seen the worst already, so I decided to walk to the front of the plane and check the cockpit again. The door to the cockpit was open, and I could see a single man with his back to me operating the controls. He seemed normal enough, but after what I had experienced on this plane, I knew the last person I wanted to bother would be the captain. I swear that I saw him turn his head around and look at me as I turned around and walked back. The plane landed eventlessly, and those emergency rubber slides also opened up to serve as exits in a place where there were no airports. Before I left the plane, I salvaged as much food and water as I could. Some of you may say that I should have stayed in the plane. While that would have been a good move, how long would I last there? Days, at the most weeks. It's best that I get myself used to this new dimension that I found myself in, rather than sit there and then look for food when I was starving. And of course, I still can't forget about the Chaser, who I believe is still on the plane. The landscape was an endless red desert. The only thing that stood out in the landscape were the occasional purple trees and the tons of concrete buildings. The heat was unbearable. I looked up at the sky and saw 3 large suns in different positions, all radiating their heat and light onto this planet. The ground was incredibly dry, and I doubt the place ever received any rain. In fact, there were several ravines that were filled with lava and molten rock. I knew that I couldn't even survive a day in this heat, and I'd already completely soaked my clothes in sweat. I started to walk over to the closest concrete city that I could find. It only took me about 10 minutes to walk there, but those 10 minutes were absolute agony, as I struggled to keep on walking in the heat. The beams from the 3 suns burnt the skin on the back of my neck and ears as I walked for those 10 minutes. Just when I was about to pass out, I found the shade of a concrete building and I threw myself into it. The relief was instant, and while the temperature didn't suddenly drop, it was 100 times better than being out in the open. I finished an entire bottle of water in one sip and continued to lie down on the floor, nearly passing out from exhaustion and the heat. I didn't notice the suited man when he had walked in front of me. "Welcome to hell, lost soul." He said that phrase like he had said it a million times and he was bored of it. He wore a black suit even in the sweltering heat and didn't seem to be a tiny bit uncomfortable. "Hell?" I asked, clearly confused at this man's statement. It may have been the heat getting to my head though, because that would have not been confusing to me and would actually explain the previous events. "Oh yes, son, this is hell. You're an unexpected visitor though. Usually we keep track of who's coming in." He said in a tone similar to one a teacher would use when their student asked a dumb question. "Oh, don't worry though. It's not a rare occurrence to have people that come and go. I'm not sure if you'll be able to leave though, so I'll set you up with what you are going to have to do for eternity," he said, as if he was just doing his regular job. "What do I have to do?" I asked, unable to fathom what the horrible task must be. "No, it's simple. We'll take you under the ground where the beings that run your world will consume your fear, and eventually your soul as sustenance," he said in a cold tone. I immediately stood up and began to run, but no matter how far I ran, the man seemed to be right beside me. He wasn't running, no, he was just standing still, waiting for me to give up. I tried my best to keep going, but the sweltering heat didn't make it any better. I was far away from the concrete city now, but the man suddenly snapped his fingers, and I was back under the shade of the building. "You can't escape," he smiled. And that's how I learned about the first rule of hell. There is no escape. But I got out, didn't I? How else would I be telling you this now? All I can say is that I'm extremely lucky. The man snapped his fingers once more and we were down in what looked to be a vast underground cellar. I saw people being attacked in each cell by unimaginable creatures. I got a headache looking at those creatures and could not look at them for a long time. The geometry of their bodies didn't make any sense. They had completely different parts. They weren't even composed of earthly colors. These were new colors that I had no words to describe. To this day, I will never get these screams in that cellar out of my head. As the man walked me through this horrible place, I only had one word in mind. Why? "Your souls are very powerful. We feed on your fear and suffering. If we didn't do this, the earth and your reality would not exist. As a return for letting you live a life on the paradise known as Earth, you give us your souls. Don't worry though, this doesn't happen for eternity. Eventually, your souls are fully consumed in no more than empty husks. You will find plenty of wasted souls roaming around up above," the man explained. "So there's no heaven," I pleaded. "What about God?" "There is no heaven. God has long left your kind behind. He considers your kind a failure and lets us deal with you as we please." I stood there in the underground chamber as a suited man told me about the afterlife and how it works. You know what's worse than that though? Monday mornings. Okay, maybe not. I was quite literally dead, and now this man was going to chuck me in a cell for all of eternity. Except that didn't really happen. Don't worry, you really think we waste souls here first? No, at first we make them work. Make them keep the barrier between your reality and ours strong, the suited man said, immediately putting away the worst of my worries. And then, almost immediately, a weird being made entirely of light appeared next to us. The being did not have a definite shape, and looking at it, it was like looking at the sun. It seemed to stand there and communicate with the suited man before leaving. With the snap of his fingers, the suited man teleported us away from that chamber, and we were now instead inside what I could only guess were one of the concrete buildings. "There's been a mistake, Ethan," the man said in sorrow. "What happened?" I asked. And then suddenly, the world started to warp around me as if reality was still a body of water that was now rippling from an interruption. Colors started to swirl around like watercolor, and before I knew it, I found myself on the plane again with the sheet of rules clutched in my hand, and the same young man next to me. I had been given a second chance, and this time, things would be a little different. I immediately looked away from the young man and ignored his cries for attention. I ignored the flight attendant too, and suddenly the whole cabin was yelling at me. Their shouts nearly caught my attention and made me turn around to tell them to just shut up, but I stayed put and stared at my lap. Suddenly, the young man brought his head on my lap and stared directly into my eyes with those uncanny features. I could feel my heart in my throat as he slowly said, in my mother's voice, "Ethan," he teased, as his voice shifted from my mother's to my dad's, and then to the voices of some of my friends. I trembled and tried to avoid the completely disturbing features of his face so close to me by closing his eyes, which only made him angrier. It seems the creatures had no way to touch me until I acknowledged them, so I thought I was safe. The other rules were a breeze to follow except for the chaser one. The chaser was still Sarah, and she started to come towards me as soon as the hour had started. I continued to run, but Sarah followed after me, calling for me. I tried not to get myself into a dead end, and continued looping around the seats until the hour had passed. My legs were tired, and I was utterly defeated. Soon the captain made a landing announcement, and this time, I managed to jump into the void. The void accepted me as it started to wrap its tendrils around me. All I could see was a thick, rich, velvety black, as I fell and fell for who knows how long. I started to hear the rhythmic beeping of some sort of machinery, and tried to focus on it until I realized what it was. I woke up in a hospital bed, covered from head to toe in a cast. Apparently, I had been involved in a serious car crash. The doctor said that I was dead for a total of 3 minutes and I had miraculously survived. You might ask me why I didn't tell the doctors about my experience. Well, they would never believe me. After years of rehab, I gained the ability to be able to do most things in life, and everything started to become normal again. That is, until the suited man visited me again. It was a cool Saturday evening, and I was going for a walk in the park to try and push myself to improve my health. My athletic ability hadn't been the same since the accident. He walked over to me, and I immediately froze as he held his hands up defensively in front of him to signify he meant no harm. "I just want to explain some things," he offered sincerely. "You were never supposed to go to hell, Ethan. It wasn't your time yet. When these souls' time comes, it is taken to hell in a sort of purgatory, you could say. It manifests differently depending on the person, and your own unique purgatory was the plane. The flight attendant that gave you the list of rules realized the error, and gave you the list to give you a chance to fight your way out of the purgatory and return to Earth. It was not in our power to return you ourselves, therefore you had to do it. I found you in hell unaccounted for, and I was ready to put your soul to work, when another higher being told me to send you back in the plane and give you a second chance so that you could return," he explained. "Cool, but why do you find the need to tell me that?" I asked. "Because this time, your time has come for real, and I see it as a personal responsibility to finish off what we were on to last time," he said as his lips curled into a smile full of malice. I ran away from the man immediately, but I know that my death is near. All I can tell you guys is to enjoy your life while you still have it.
Hello there. Are you here to get...
After quitting my position at mall security, I had been looking for some sort of job involving a similar responsibility. Something had always fascinated me about it. The power, mainly. And no, don't worry, I'm not some sort of secret totalitarian who wants to rule over people's lives. Rather, I just simply enjoy the feeling of being able to patrol around in uniform. It was oddly fun for me, not quite sure why. It had been a long and grueling couple of weeks of unemployment, until I was offered a night shift job at a storage unit building that was a few miles off in the outskirts of the city. The manager of the property seemed just as thrilled to give me the job as I was to take it. It was especially cold during these times here in Minnesota. Christmas was not too far off, which I was extremely excited about. I was gonna go visit my family down in Chicago during all that. Trading presents, eating good food, and indulging in social interaction. I'm still only 27 years old at the time of writing this, so my excitement of being able to drink was still quite strong. I wasn't an alcoholic by any means, but coming home after a long day of work and cracking open a cold beer never hurt anyone. When the night had finally arrived for me to start my first shift, I was relaxed in my admittedly messy apartment and watching whatever had piqued my interest on Netflix until it was nearly 7 in the evening. I lived alone, so I hadn't ever really worried about bothering others with my lazy appearance whenever I had nothing to do for the day. It wasn't that I was a deadbeat or anything. I just never felt the need to overachieve or to do more than what was expected of me. But yet whenever I did do any hard work, I always felt proud of myself. But tonight was different. I had already collected my security uniform from the owner of the building a few days previously, so I was all dressed up and ready to go. But for some reason, I collected the uniform of the guy's house instead of the building, which I found to be a little strange, but try not to dig too deep into it. This night would be my first night seeing the actual building itself. I already had the address of the place written down. I hopped in the car and began my drive over to the storage unit building. I had lived in the city pretty much all my life, so I was always used to the hectic and often chaotic nature of the roads. Even at nighttime, these streets were often crowded, way more so than they should have been. My shift had actually started at 9, but the traffic on my way had held me back for nearly an hour, and my euphoria of excitement was beginning to dwindle into bitter frustration at all the people who had either cut me off or drove so slow to the point to where getting out and running seemed like a more valid option. I did my best to keep my head up though. There was no need to delve into such a mindless anger over something that wasn't even so bad in the grand scheme of things. The destination was worth the trip. After it seemed like an eternity, I had finally arrived at the area of the storage unit building. It was even more isolated than what I had originally thought. It was a large, square-shaped cement structure with 2 big iron doors on the front. In between the doors was a large chain lock keeping them together, which I had the key for. Behind the building was the beginning of a very eerie-looking forest. Nothing but trees and bushes for miles is what it seemed like. I was definitely alone out here, so the chances of having to deal with burglary seemed pretty low. I smiled, thinking about how this job was going to be even easier than I thought. It even paid well above minimum wage. I didn't see how I could have landed a sweeter deal than what was in front of me. I parked my car off to the side where the iron door to the left ended, and it was just pure cement. I reached into the back seat of the car and grabbed my nightstick, my flashlight, and the keys to the building before hesitantly stepping outside of the car. Marching my way up to the colossal doors, I kept my eyes low towards the concrete ground. The sounds of the crickets and owls in the distance was enough to keep me comfortable in what was otherwise a strangely quiet night. Now, although that would have put most people on edge, I found it rather relaxing. For once, these sounds of cars, buses, and trains were gone. Once I had found the right key to the lock, I lifted my head to begin unlocking it. However, when I looked up, I saw something that not only made me shiver in place, but caused me to jump back so suddenly that I dropped the key itself. "What the hell?" I blurted, stepping back a few feet to process the sight. On the doors, where the large lock was, were scratches. Very long, large scratches that looked as if a steroid-induced brown bear had done it. Just a second ago, the door looked completely untouched and was as smooth as butter. A clean, white pristine finish over the iron material. The chains of the lock had also been cut by whatever had made the scratches, which seemed impossible for me to not be able to hear, considering I was right next to the dang thing. "Well, I guess there's no need for the key then," I muttered nervously to myself, picking up the keys with slightly shaking hands. Putting a hand on each iron door, I heaved and pushed with all my might and opened the doors. Luckily, they had supports built into them. Otherwise, there was no way that I was getting in without explosives. The door gave off a very low, rumbling noise as I pushed them further and further open, almost as if they had voices of their own. After a few more seconds of finally pushing and putting my back into it, the doors were finally open and I could step inside. When I looked forward, the building had a pretty simple layout. There was a long and 10-foot wide hallway down the middle, and multiple small garage door storage units on each side. At the very end sat a medium-sized wooden desk, with a black leather chair behind it, accompanied by a small glass window that looked onto the desk where supposedly I was going to be stationed for the night. Towards the top of the ceiling ran a long metal balcony that circled the entire rectangular perimeter of the interior. When I turned and repeated the process that I had gone through earlier to open the doors in order to close them, I could have sworn that I saw what looked to be like a small, brittle, and skinny-looking little boy staring at me just before the door shut.